I had a conversation the other day with a consultant, came through our workshops and liked what we did, and we're talking, and uh, they were quite impressed with the methodology and really wanted to know more about how we can help and whether we're a fit to work together and all those things. And the question I asked was, well, before we get into how we can help and whether you're a good fit, tell me this: what problem are we trying to solve here? So what do you mean? Well, if you have a problem that needs solving, we can talk about solving it. If you don't have a problem that needs solving, then yes, our methodology is great, but you don't need it if there's no problem to solve. Well, I'm busy and getting good amount of volume right now, and things are going great and fantastic. So then we don't work together because you don't have an urgent problem that's keeping you up at night or that is causing you any kind of material grief or uncertainty or what have you. And I think it, to me, is an important lesson in you can't manufacture urgency. Mm-hmm. And many people on that call, on that conversation, in my position would try to create, well, what about this? And have you considered, and what about your pipeline? And where is your next deal going to come? Like, they would try to ask questions. If you go to a sales trainer, they probably teach you to ask questions that drive urgency. Mm-hmm. And this is where I fundamentally have a disagreement about urgency with a lot of what's taught in sales training, is that I don't believe you can manufacture urgency. They either have it or they don't.
Yeah, and I think you talk about sales training, a lot of it is just super oversimplified, because although we're not saying that the right thing to do is to ask questions to try to manufacture urgency. What you do want to do is ask the questions that uncover it, right? And that's it's a subtle but important difference, because if you are asking questions to we talk a lot about try to mind game people into buying your service. If that's what you're doing, and that's often what those questions are, then that's where you're going to get yourself into trouble. And the reality is you're probably asking them because right? You may know more than them. You may be able to see further down the path because of your expertise, and you can actually see, what problem is going to exist for them in the future. And so you think, if I just help them understand that, then they'll get it and we'll be able to move forward together. But what that is really missing is their actual emotion, right? Their feeling about it, their true concern that's driving them to solve the problem. And so what I would say is, it's not about asking questions. It's not about not asking questions that point to the urgency, but this is where you want to be curious instead of directive, right? You want to ask them, what's going to happen if this doesn't get solved in the next 6 weeks? And if their answer is, oh, nothing, it's probably fine for the next year. Okay. They don't have urgency. If their answer is, well, the world will end as I know it, then it exists. And then you can have a different kind of conversation with them.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, it doesn't matter if they're right or wrong necessarily. Yeah. They could say nothing will happen, and they could be wrong, and it doesn't matter. There's no urgency. You're not going to talk them into it. And they could say the world's going to come to an end, and they could be wrong, and it doesn't matter. They have urgency. Right? Mm-hmm. And I think it reminds me of some research that was done in public health around why people quit smoking. This is probably decades old at this stage, but still true. And what they found was that it's not like one event, mm-hmm. not one thing. It's not one circumstance that like you see in the movies, right? Like, this major life event happens, and all of a sudden somebody makes a huge change, quit smoking, quit drinking, whatever, right? And now they're a completely different person a few days later. That's not actually how behavior changes. What the researchers found was that there's this storm of circumstances. I think they called it a motivational cloud, is the technical term that they use. A motivational cloud. It was all these other circumstances came together and formed like this perfect storm. that finally push people over a certain threshold of urgency or motivation and got them to finally take some action. And so when you think about it that way, put yourself in the prospect's shoes. If they're not feeling a ton of urgency and they talk to you, what are the odds you're going to be that final piece that pushes them over the edge and creates urgency? I mean, it's possible. It's possible, but it's very unlikely, because the reality is that they have other circumstances that they're feeling that are much more significant to them in terms of the signal that they get than their conversation with you. You're an outsider. You're a stranger. They don't trust you yet. So obviously, you're going to tell them it's urgent because you have an agenda, whether you acknowledge it or not. You have an agenda for them to feel urgency, so they'll buy something. So they're discounting everything that you're saying, and they're taking way more stock, as they should, frankly, in their own lived experience. And if that lived experience is not creating urgency in and of itself, the odds of you tipping the scale, highly unlikely. And if you try, there's a cost to that. The cost is an erosion of trust. This person just wants me to buy something.
Well, and I would argue that actually you might be able to do it, right? If you go in there and you're really smooth and you tell all the stories and you get them to a place in that conversation where you tip them over the edge and they buy with you, you're going to feel like you won. But I'm here to tell you that what you've just closed is a terrible deal. Because if they are not living with that sense of urgency and concern and, agitation, it's not going to take them long to have some buyer's remorse, right? It's not going to take them long to be disappointed in what you're doing because it's not, solving a real keep me up at night problem. So, a good sales guy might, and usually is a guy, will say, I can close anyone, right? I can convince anyone. And this is where I think, I want to remind you that that's not the goal. The goal is to align yourself with the people that really need what you're doing, because that's where you're going to have success. That's where you're going to get people who rave about what you've done. That's where you're going to get referrals. That's where they're going to be truly satisfied versus, arm wrestling them into making a purchase and then having them regret it the minute that they've signed the deal.
You're selling consulting, and that's a really intimate relationship, and there's a longer tail on delivery, and the last thing that you want is an unmotivated client. So if the motivation or the urgency isn't there to begin with, you don't want them in a relationship and an engagement with you where they are dragging their feet, not doing their part, not active partners, not bought in. Yeah, the check might clear, but your life is otherwise going to be quite miserable. Now, I think it's important to get into a little bit more nuance here around creating or manufacturing urgency, which we're obviously warning you against. I fundamentally don't believe that you can create or manufacture urgency. And even if you could, you probably shouldn't. Versus highlighting, surfacing, uncovering urgency. That's a different conversation. And I think it's worth noting here that sometimes maybe oftentimes we like to sweep urgency under the rug and not look at it. I reminded of another conversation with somebody who's now a client, and I asked for their revenue, prior year revenue, and the answer was, "Ooh, I don't really want to look." Right? There's urgency there. There's also a hesitation to engage the urgency. There's a hesitation to engage the circumstances creating the urgency. So this person, who's very, very smart and saw that for themselves, ultimately was trying to bury their head in the sands to an extent and avoid dealing with the circumstances that are creating urgency and talking about the urgency head on, which is not good. And absolutely, you as a consultant, seller, advisor, need to be the one who asks the difficult questions to help them encounter and surface that urgency so they can deal with it.
The other thing I think that's interesting, we're talking about like having this conversation about urgency in the context of the discovery call, right? The sales conversation. And I also think it's worth going back a few steps, because ideally what you want to be doing is having conversations with people who already feel the sense of urgency, right? What we're not suggesting is that you should be living in a world where 90% of the people you talk to don't have the sense of urgency and it's your job to, parse this out during a conversation. There are a lot of things you can do to make sure that by the time they get to you, right, by the time they're talking to you, you're connecting with the people who already have that sense of urgency. And those are your people, right? We often talk about the ideal prospect, the ideal client. And I don't know that it's often enough discussed the specifics of their mental state, right? Not about what they need, not about what problem they have, but how it is that they feel. And that's really what this is. And so what that means is that going out into the world and, publishing content and writing white papers and, doing all the things where you're talking narrowly about the problem itself is great. Yes, you're an expert. That's fine. You're going to feel good about it. But what it's not going to do is necessarily, have the people who have that urgent sense be drawn to you, because that's a very particular state that they're in.
Why do I buy Tylenol? Why do I buy Advil? Why do I buy naproxen, the technical term for Aleve, I think it is? Because I've got pain and I want the pain to go away.
Yeah.
And those products are positioned to remove my pain. If they were positioned as, herbs that'll make you feel better in a general sense, I wouldn't buy them when I'm feeling intense pain from a migraine or from an injury or something like that, right? And so this is fundamentally a positioning problem where, to your point, I think a lot of consultants would relate to the feeling of, well, I'm talking to people, but they don't have urgency. Mm-hmm. Either they don't have the problem that I solve, or they don't see it, they don't acknowledge it's a problem, or they don't have urgency around the problem. And so what are you going to do? You can't create it. You can't manufacture it. You can simply filter for it. And if nobody has it, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
Not going to close many deals. Now, that doesn't mean that there's nobody in your market that has urgency. Yeah, unless you're solving some really obscure problem that very few clients have, that's a separate conversation. But assuming that you're solving what is otherwise a pervasive problem that many clients within a demographic audience are going to have, then within that, there's going to be some who have urgency and some who don't. And so the challenge likely is you're simply not attracting the ones who have urgency because you're not speaking to their urgency in your marketing and your positioning. So one of the questions that we ask inside 90-day pipeline when clients are working on their positioning is, what is the perfect storm of circumstances that makes clients need somebody like you? Not just what problem do they have, because plenty of clients have the problem that you solve and are not going to hire you because they don't have urgency. But more specifically, what's going on right now in their world that is creating urgency around the problem, which you can then speak to in your marketing, in your positioning, in your messaging, so they can look at you and go, oh, okay, this person addresses the problem that we're solving, that we're facing rather, and will remove that urgency that we're feeling and that frustration that we're feeling, because clearly they directly address those issues at this stage, as opposed to just, oh, there's an expert who can solve a problem.